7 years together, 5 pregnancies, 5 heart-wrenching decisions. Emily Thompson had shared everything with James Donovan. Her hopes, her dreams, her future. Together they'd braved storms, battled through crises, and somehow survived. Or so she thought. But in the stillness of the night, everything fell apart. Without warning, the man she loved walked away. Not just from her, but from everything they'd built. The person he walked toward? Her best friend. The betrayal shook Emily to her very core, leaving her struggling to understand how everything they'd shared could disappear in an instant. Then, just days after uncovering the painful truth, she was found dead. What drove this shocking act? How could a love that once seemed so strong end in such violence? Could anyone have seen it coming? Stay with us as we uncover the heart-wrenching story of a life shattered by betrayal and a murder that no one expected. Emily Thompson was 29, a woman caught in the tension between the ideal of love and the harshness of reality. She had spent 7 years with James Donovan, a man she thought would be her forever. Together they'd built a life, a fragile dream, filled with both happiness and hardship. It wasn't perfect, but whose relationship is? Emily held on, believing that love, no matter how complicated, would always find a way forward. Over the years, they faced challenges that would have torn most couples apart. The emotional weight of 5 abortions left deep scars, but they weathered each loss, each setback, together. Yet the toll of those decisions began to chip away at their connection in ways Emily couldn't fully grasp. She tried to stay strong, tried to keep everything together, but there's only so much one person can give before it starts to unravel. James was the man she had given everything to. But in the end, she wasn't the one who would receive everything in return. The person who would take her place, the one who would be there when James finally walked away, was someone Emily knew all too well. Sophia Martinez. Sophia wasn't just a friend, she was Emily's closest confidant, the person she trusted more than anyone. They shared everything, hopes, fears, even the deepest secrets. There were no walls between them, no distance. Or so Emily thought. Because everything changed one fateful evening when James left her, not for a stranger, but for the one person she never imagined could betray her. The pain was unbearable, but the cruelty was something Emily couldn't even fathom. To her, it wasn't just the loss of James, it was the loss of a friendship she believed was unbreakable. 7 years, 5 painful losses, and her heart, now she was left with nothing. But what Emily didn't realize was that this betrayal would lead to something far darker than a broken heart. It wouldn't just mark the end of her love for James, it would mark the end of her life. As the days passed, Emily's pain and anger grew. What she didn't expect was how far the people closest to her would go, how their decisions would corner her in a way she couldn't escape. It wasn't just the loss of love, it was the loss of a life. What began as a betrayal between lovers would soon spiral into something far more chilling. The truth hit Emily like an icy wave. She had already sensed the growing distance between her and James, but nothing could have prepared her for the bombshell that shattered her entire world. James and Sophia weren't just friends, they had been seeing each other behind her back for months. Emily stumbled across the truth in a message on James's phone, and the instant her eyes scanned the words, her stomach turned. It wasn't some fleeting affair. It was a full-blown relationship, and Emily had been living a lie. The weight of the betrayal sank in like a stone. This wasn't just about love. It was about trust, about all the years they had spent together, and the future they had planned. Emily tried to process it, to make sense of what she was seeing. The pain was suffocating, but what came next was even harder. The confrontation. Late that evening, after hours of pacing, tears, and endless questions, Emily made the decision. She needed to see James and Sophia, to face them, to demand answers. She couldn't let the anger and heartbreak sit inside her anymore. This wasn't a moment of emotional outburst. It was a confrontation, an attempt to get clarity from the two people who had torn her life apart. When Emily arrived at Sophia's apartment, her heart pounded in her chest. The betrayal felt like a weight pressing down on her. Sophia opened the door, her face unreadable, but Emily could see something flicker in her eyes. Something that wasn't guilt, not yet, but a coldness that made her skin crawl. Behind Sophia, James stood silently, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, but had no intention of speaking. "I know what's going on," Emily said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "How could you, James? How could you do this to me, to us?" Sophia stepped back, but it was James who spoke. His voice was cold, distant, and oddly rehearsed. "It's over, Emily. I've made my choice." The words hung in the air, suffocating. For a brief moment, Emily just stood there, feeling the finality of it all. The years they had shared, the love, the sacrifices, it all seemed meaningless in that instant. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. Then, they came anyway. "Do you really think I'm just supposed to walk away from this?" Emily's voice was now trembling, but it carried an anger neither of them seemed ready for. "You've taken everything from me. Everything." What followed was a storm of accusations, heated words, and broken pleas. Each sentence, each look, felt like a gut punch. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she'd ever known, stripping away the love, the trust, and the friendship in front of her eyes. Every word, every glance, felt like a new wound. The argument escalated quickly. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a battle. And in that moment, something inside Emily snapped. Her pain and rage boiled over and she screamed at them, her fury like a fire burning out of control. And just as suddenly, the confrontation ended. James and Sophia stood there, expressionless, while Emily stumbled out of the apartment, her heart shattered beyond repair. She couldn't stay there, not with them. She needed to escape, to think, to process. But deep down she knew there was no answer that would ever undo the damage. That night Emily returned to her apartment, the weight of everything bearing down on her. It wasn't just the affair, it was the destruction of everything she had believed in. She tried to calm herself, to regain some composure, but the emotions were too overwhelming. There was no escaping the anger, the grief, the loss. Hours later, as the darkness crept in, Emily became restless. She tried to distract herself, but the reality of what had happened kept pulling her back. She was alone now, completely alone. The life she thought she had was gone. Her mind raced with questions, each more horrifying than the last. How could they have done this to her? It was around 2 a.m. when the violence erupted. A neighbor reported hearing shouting coming from Emily's apartment, followed by a loud crash, a scream that echoed through the building, and then silence. The silence was deafening. By the time the police arrived, hours later, they found Emily lying in a pool of blood, stabbed multiple times in what was clearly a brutal, targeted attack. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone Emily knew well. And the nature of the crime, how the stabbing was relentless and almost frenzied, told the investigators this wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't an act of impulse. This was personal, this was calculated. The brutality of the murder was chilling. There were multiple stab wounds to her chest and abdomen, each one delivered with such force it left no doubt about the killer's rage. Emily's apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a crime scene. A place where the life she had built had been torn apart in the most horrific way. But what disturbed the investigators most wasn't just the violence, it was the location. Emily had been murdered in her own home, the one place she should have felt safest, the place where she had shared years of memories with James, where she had once believed their future would unfold. Instead, it had become the place where her life ended. At first, all signs pointed to James. His behavior, the argument, his abandonment, it seemed to fit the pattern of a man overwhelmed by guilt and shame, pushed to extreme measures. But as the investigators dug deeper into the timeline of events, they began to question everything. Was this a crime of passion, fueled by jealousy and rage, or was there something more sinister at play? One thing was clear, the crime wasn't just about betrayal. Someone had wanted Emily silenced, and whoever had done it wasn't going to stop there. The moment Emily was discovered in her apartment, bleeding out and barely clinging to life, the police were immediately called. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but despite their best efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The damage from the multiple stab wounds had been too severe, and the blood loss was catastrophic. For the detectives, the case was troubling on multiple levels. Emily's death wasn't just tragic, it was brutal, intimate. This wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever killed her had a personal stake in her life. It didn't take long to narrow down the list of potential suspects. The first two under suspicion were, of course, James and Sophia. Both had been at the center of the emotional storm that led up to Emily's death. The affair, the betrayal, their entire relationship was now under the microscope. They were questioned separately, but both denied any involvement in Emily's murder. James insisted that his relationship with Sophia had only happened because Emily had grown emotionally distant in the months leading up to their breakup. He claimed he had no idea who could have hurt her. Sophia, too, appeared genuinely distressed, denying any role in the crime and maintaining that she had only been Emily's friend. She said she was devastated by the loss. But something about their responses didn't sit right. The police couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than they were letting on. Emily's murder was deeply personal, and there was a long history between the victim and her closest companions. It was clear the detectives needed to dig deeper. They started with James. His emotions were raw, but his alibi was shaky. He had left his apartment the night of the murder, but his whereabouts during the critical hours remained unclear. Could his frustration with Emily, his anger at being trapped in their relationship, have pushed him to violence? Did he want to end things permanently, to free himself from the emotional weight of their past? James's background added a disturbing layer to the investigation. Growing up surrounded by instability, his relationships, especially with women, had often been marked by manipulation and control. The detectives learned that he had a history of jealousy and possessiveness. The dynamic between him and Emily had been unhealthy for years. 5 abortions, 5 heartbreaking losses. Each one had left a mark. Emily had once confided to a close friend that James would often make her feel guilty for those decisions, especially after each loss. That emotional manipulation suddenly made sense. Was James simply tired of it all? Had Emily's pain, her anger, her constant need for reassurance finally become too much for him to bear? Was it possible that he had snapped, deciding that ending their relationship was the only way to regain control over his life? But just when it seemed James might be the obvious culprit, something unexpected surfaced. As investigators combed through Emily's personal belongings, searching for more clues, they turned their attention to her phone records. Texts between Emily and Sophia revealed some intense, emotional exchanges. Some of the messages hinted at a tension between the two women long before Emily's death. But it was the series of increasingly intimate texts between Sophia and James that caught the detectives' attention. One message from James stood out: "We can't keep hiding this. It'll all be over soon." The detectives were stunned. This wasn't just an affair. It was a carefully planned escape, a betrayal on a far deeper level. The text confirmed what they had suspected. James and Sophia weren't just sneaking around behind Emily's back, they had been planning to leave her all along. This wasn't just a relationship gone wrong, it was a calculated deception. Yet even as the pressure mounted on James, something else began to emerge. There was one piece of evidence that had initially gone unnoticed: Sophia's missing necklace. It was a distinctive gold chain, one that Emily had often remarked upon in the past, and it was nowhere to be found. Why would Sophia, the last person to see Emily alive, be wearing it one moment and have it disappear the next? The missing necklace would prove to be more significant than anyone realized. After a more thorough search of the crime scene, the investigators discovered it hidden under Emily's couch cushions, buried beneath a pile of clothes. The detectives now had a startling new theory. Perhaps Sophia had been more directly involved in the murder than anyone had imagined. The timeline of events began to take on a more disturbing shape. James and Sophia's affair had been escalating for months, But there was something else in play here. The emotional manipulation, the simmering jealousy, the unresolved anger. It all seemed to build to that moment of violence. Could it be that Sophia, feeling both guilty and desperate to keep James for herself, took matters into her own hands? Was it possible that she had been more involved in the murder than anyone had realized, pushing things to a brutal conclusion when Emily confronted them? With the missing necklace and the increasingly suspicious texts, the detectives began to wonder whether James had been the only one pulling the strings, or if Sophia had in fact played a much larger role in the murder than they had initially suspected. But this twist raised more questions than answers. Was Sophia merely a victim of circumstance, dragged into the mess that James had created? Or had she become complicit in something far darker, something far more premeditated than anyone could have foreseen? As the investigation unfolded, each new piece of evidence pulled the detectives deeper into a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal, leaving them to wonder how far both James and Sophia were willing to go to keep their dark secret buried. As the investigation continued, the case grew more complex and disturbing with each new piece of evidence. The timeline of Emily's final night became a focal point for the detectives, and they turned their attention to the hours leading up to her death. Both James and Sophia had been unaccounted for during the critical moments. The holes in their alibis were too glaring to ignore, and the inconsistencies in their stories only raised more questions. But then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: CCTV footage. A camera across the street from Emily's apartment building had captured Sophia walking alone at 9:45 p.m. the night of the murder. She was wearing the same coat she had been seen in earlier that evening, and her movements seemed deliberate, almost as if she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped briefly outside Emily's building, looked around, and then disappeared into the shadows. This footage completely contradicted Sophia's initial claims. She had told the police she'd been at home, grieving in private, but now the footage suggested she had been near the scene, possibly in the very window of time when Emily was attacked. Had she been lurking outside, waiting for the perfect moment to make her move? At the same time, James's alibi was starting to fall apart. He had said he was at a friend's house that night, but the investigation found no evidence to support his story. His friend had no recollection of him visiting, and the timeline he had given didn't match up with the medical reports. There was still a large gap during the critical period when Emily had been attacked. Could James have lied? Had he fabricated an alibi to cover his tracks and avoid suspicion? The case had shifted. It was no longer just about betrayal. It was something far darker and more calculated. The detectives began to theorize that what started as an affair and emotional turmoil had escalated into something much more violent. Emily, once a loving partner, had likely become a target, not just because of the affair, but because of the years of emotional manipulation and control she had endured at James's hands. The long, drawn-out arguments, the constant emotional toll, had they finally worn down the fragile foundation of their relationship? Could that have been enough to push someone over the edge? As the detectives combed through the evidence, they began to understand that there was more at play here than just a simple love triangle. The years of manipulation, the emotional games, the power struggles. These were key pieces in a much larger puzzle. But the crucial question remained: had Sophia, overwhelmed by guilt and jealousy, been pushed into becoming the final instrument of Emily's death? Or had James, feeling cornered by his lies and his own rage, turned on the one person who had always been there for him? Each new revelation only made the case more intricate. This wasn't just about a betrayal of love. It was a story of emotional abuse, of manipulation that had been hidden for years, and of a relationship that had been fractured and twisted into something far more violent than anyone had ever expected. After weeks of mounting evidence and intense interrogation, the authorities finally made their move. James Donovan and Sophia Martinez were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The charges shocked the community, but what left everyone reeling wasn't just the crime itself. It was the unsettling realization of the web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal that had been woven over the years. James and Sophia, once seen as two innocent people tangled in a tragic love triangle, were now the central figures in a case that made everyone question the lengths people will go to for love, for control, and for a chance at freedom. The police had built a strong case, one that not only exposed their motives but also revealed the chilling level of premeditation behind the crime. The emotional abuse, the constant manipulation between James and Emily, and the calculated affair between James and Sophia had all laid the groundwork for the deadly confrontation that ended Emily's life. When the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time laying out the pieces of the puzzle. The CCTV footage was presented. Sophia caught on camera walking near Emily's apartment just hours before the murder. Emily's phone records were shown, revealing the escalating tension between her, James, and Sophia. The texts between James and Sophia made it clear how deep their betrayal ran, and how they had both conspired against Emily, the one person who had trusted them the most. The prosecution also made it clear that this wasn't a crime of passion. The violence was calculated, the attack precise, showing the depth of the anger and resentment that had been simmering for so long. Emily's death was not a random act or a moment of blind rage. It was the brutal outcome of years of emotional manipulation, guilt, and psychological warfare between the three of them. Despite their attempts to deny any involvement, both James and Sophia were convicted. The evidence was undeniable. The jury found them guilty of second-degree murder, and both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction, however, brought little comfort to the community. While some felt justice had been served, many others couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker had been hidden in plain sight. The case shattered the illusion of a picture-perfect relationship, peeling back the layers of deceit to reveal the devastating consequences of betrayal. As the courtroom emptied, a chilling thought lingered. How much of Emily's tragic fate could have been avoided if the truth had been exposed sooner? Could a single choice, a single conversation, have changed the course of everything? Or was the deception too ingrained, too deep, for anyone to escape the inevitable consequences? The trial had ended, but the emotional scars on the victims, the perpetrators, and the community would last far longer than any sentence could. The conviction of James Donovan and Sophia Martinez may have brought the case to a close in the courtroom, but for Emily's family, the emotional toll was far from over. The grief was all-consuming, losing a daughter, a friend, a sister far too soon to the people she had trusted most. Her parents, siblings, and those who loved her were left trying to piece together a life that had been violently taken from them. They never imagined that the story of love, hope, and family would end this way. The betrayal by James and Sophia hadn't just robbed them of Emily, it had fractured an entire family. Meanwhile, the relationship between James and Sophia, once concealed from the public, now unraveled under the unforgiving spotlight of media attention. What had seemed like a love affair between two people seeking a new beginning soon revealed itself to be part of a much darker, more twisted narrative. One where love, manipulation, and violence blurred into a toxic mix. The public began to see them for what they truly were, not just two lovers, but two people whose actions had led to a devastating loss. But as time went on, a lingering question kept tugging at the minds of those who followed the case. Who was truly responsible for Emily's death? Yes, James and Sophia had been convicted, but something felt off. Was their crime solely the result of a shared betrayal, or was there something more? Could James have acted alone in a moment of blind rage, overwhelmed by guilt and frustration? Or was it possible that Sophia, driven by a complex mix of jealousy, guilt, or even a desire to remove Emily from the equation, had played a more significant role in planning the murder? The evidence pointed to a shared responsibility, but no one could say where the line between guilt and complicity truly began. And so, as the months passed, the questions lingered. Was this tragedy the inevitable result of years of emotional manipulation and betrayal? Could anyone have seen the warning signs, or was Emily's fate sealed by forces too powerful to stop? It was a haunting thought. Could it have been prevented? In the end, while justice had been served in the courtroom, The case left the community grappling with a chilling truth. Love, trust, and relationships are fragile things, and when they break, the consequences are often far worse than anyone could ever imagine. As for the unanswered questions about the depth of the conspiracy, some believe the full story lies buried in the minds of James and Sophia. Perhaps, in time, more revelations will come to light. Will they ever come clean about everything, or will the truth remain locked away, as hidden as the future Emily could have had? For now, the mystery has closed, but the questions still echo. And the haunting reality is clear. Once trust is shattered, it may never be restored. The damage can last a lifetime. The case of Emily Thompson may have been closed, but the questions surrounding it continue to haunt us. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Was there more lurking beneath the surface, more than anyone realized? As the truth remains buried in the shadows, one question looms larger than all the others. What happens when love turns into obsession? In our next video, we'll dive into another jaw-dropping story of betrayal, a tale where the line between love and obsession is blurred beyond recognition. A childhood friend, once considered a safe haven, hides a deadly secret that will turn everything upside down. What lengths will they go to in order to protect their past? And what happens when a seemingly innocent reunion becomes a deadly game of cat and mouse? You won't want to miss this. Hit that subscribe button now because the story doesn't end here. The truth is waiting to be uncovered. What do you think really went down between James and Sophia? Was this murder something they plotted all along? Or did a sudden rush of passion push them to the edge? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your theories. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our chilling true crime stories. Trust us, what's coming next is something you won't want to miss.